Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. This week I watched Get Duked from 2019. Now, this is a movie I thought was going to be a little bit different than it turned out to be, but we'll get there in a moment. This is a movie I expect that most people haven't heard of for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which is that it's kind of a small budget niche film. The way that I recall originally finding out about it was actually before it came out. An actor I'm a big fan of, Eddie Izzard, was talking about how this was in production and she had a role in it, and it was just something sort of on the horizon that was being worked on. So I was kind of curious, like having heard her talk about it and see a little bit about it, what it would turn out to be. This was put up as sort of a black comedy, British black comedy, which, as I've talked about before, I'm a fan of black comedy, and I think the Brits tend to do it very well. And I have been really interested to see over the years how the sort of that dry British humor has evolved into something different than it was, 20, 40, even 60 years ago. God, some of the content I've consumed is very, very old now. But anyway, this was sort of on my radar, and it does not help the fact that it's already sort of a niche product in the first place. In addition to all that, the title of the movie was also changed. And I always forget to talk about this because I often have problems with titles of movies. I always forget to comment about it. But this is not a great title for the movie. And it doesn't make a lot of sense until at least about 20 minutes in to the film. I mean, you might catch it before that, but it doesn't start to make more sense until then. And the original title of the movie was Boys in the Wood, which is just, it's very direct and gives you an idea right off the bat that this is going to be a little bit hip hop, a little bit tongue in cheek, and that it's literally about boys in the wood. So I feel like it's a much better title. I don't feel like either of them are amazing, but that's the better one. And I'm going to go ahead and say this is probably the production team at Amazon's fault, because Amazon bought the rights for it, and as far as I understand it, were the ones who renamed it, or were influencing its renaming. So anyway, fuck Amazon, so I'll just blame them, whether or not they're actually responsible. This is an interesting film for a couple of reasons, but it's also quite different than what I initially expected out of it. I expected something that was a little bit more along the lines of the very sort of... I expected a little bit more horror of one kind or another, because I think that's how if memory serves, how it was originally pitched when I was hearing about it at first. And that may have been a matter of the production that happened after or something like that. But I expected something at least that would be more of perhaps a send up of the horror genre. That's been something that's been a bit more prevalent in recent years. So I had something in mind closer to something like Tucker and Dale versus Evil, which I watched on the show some time ago. So something that was a little bit more directly appealing in some ways to a horror audience, but also very obviously a send up, and a critique in some ways. Instead, what this really is it's a black comedy with... It's hardly even a black comedy. It incorporates some individual elements of the sort of dark or black comedy genres that I think it uses fine, but that's not the central genre here. This is really just mostly straight comedy, which is fine. That said, I think it kind of meanders around a bit, both in tone and in focus. Because towards the beginning of the film, I had more of the impression that that my initial impression was correct, that it was more of a setup for a comedy surrounded by the tropes of a horror film, that we're going to have our, set of kind of goofy main characters get into shenanigans that should play out like horror, but for one reason or another, they play out differently, and, we get to play around with the genre because of that. And it does that for a little bit, and it does it in smatterings throughout the entire movie, but probably a half an hour into the film, it becomes relatively evident that isn't the core focus. Now, it's hard for me to say from a writing and direction perspective, and this is a first-time writer and director, so, I take everything with some grain of salt and forgiveness. Hard to say what exactly they had in mind in the first place. And whether, any sort of meddling from production got in the way of the original image. This at times feels like a somewhat disjointed film that isn't entirely sure what message it's trying to send or what audience it's trying to appeal to. There are scenes in here that are out of a more coming of age story like The In-Betweeners, where it's got this very awkward, at sometimes like awkward teenage vibe, and it's focused on these characters who are inherently weird and by design, kind of screw ups. And that's a very British, it's a very like modern British comedy thing. I think I would also say, point at Derry Girls as another more recent example of the same, a bit different, but the same kind of thing of like, it's goofy, high schoolers who are being both, it's both a very earnest attempt to give them a little bit of credit for their efforts while also, making fun of them, and rightly so. And so there's a certain element of this that I understand I'm not going to entirely get or not entirely feel the same way about as somebody who might have been through the British schooling system, one of the many different types of British schooling experiences in the last, 20 years. But there's an element of this that's also very universal. And in a way, this movie does, towards the end, start to say a more universal message that is, okay, I'll be honest. It comes out of the blue and it's not very well rounded, and it kind of just blindsides you and feels cheap because it's not entirely out of place, but it was not set up very well. Anyway, we'll set that aside because it's not really, it's kind of a black mark on the film, but it's not really that big a deal. It's just weird. Anyway, this movie can't entirely decide whether it wants to keep with this sort of early thing that it has going on of our main characters being thrown into horror genre situations, or this sort of in-betweeners Derry Girls thing that it's got going on more towards the middle and the end, or whether it's going towards more something like is it Wellington PD, I believe is the name of the show, or What We Do in the Shadows, that sort of the Taika Waititi like comedy of error, modern comedy of errors TV show styling. And so it kind of swishes all over the place with what exactly it's doing, and never quite seems to land. In a better constructed movie, I would expect them to be able to sort of weave those things in together pretty well. And by all accounts, this is not a bad movie as a result, but it feels very unpolished, unfinished. It's something where I wanted to see more of the horror elements as they were initially introduced, used as sort of a recurring thing to sort of drive the events forward. As it is, a lot of the events that happen throughout the film, including entire scenes or series of scenes seem to happen with almost no motivation. They're basically without cause, and I have a mixed feeling on that. On the one hand, it's not entirely unreasonable that it's just like, oh, these kids are going to go get up to wacky hijinks because they're just wacky kids. But ultimately, even for a comedy, and I think this is something that comedy falls into more often than other genres, you still need some solid narrative tie-ins to make it more than a series of scenes, more than a series of skits. You know, when you can look at an episode of Monty Python's Flying Circus and say these totally unrelated skits still had better ties to into each other than the scenes of a film, that's where it starts to be like, well, this was supposed to be one cohesive narrative. And maybe it's just a matter of a certain type of writing where and a certain intent in your presentation where it's more about the individual scenes than it is about the overall story. But especially if you cap off the end of the film the way the end of this film is, it feels like in order to validate the level of satisfaction that it's trying to give you by the end of the film, that the middle should give you a little bit more pull you along a little bit more. Ultimately, like, the characters themselves aren't super compelling, not uncompelling, but they don't have a lot of detail. They're mostly sort of ideas of a genre character, right? They're the imagined versions of people you might have met in school. And they are fun twists on horror archetypes of being like, in the sense that they are not horror archetypes. These are, for kids who are, the horror genre is very, or can be very set up to serve a certain set of narratives, right? You've got the ideas of things like Final Girls and all those sorts of things. But even in less structured horror things, say something like, you could say anything, but I'm just saying like Alien. You need a variety of character archetypes in order to play out certain scenes. Usually for horror to work, you want your characters to be in a variety of different situations where things happen to them as a result of their behaviors. Going back further in horror, that was often there was sort of a moral thing attached to a lot of earlier cinematic horror, where it was sort of a cultural criticism that might go one way or the other in terms of its social intention, whether it was regressive or progressive. But the idea of having these different characters with these different key behaviors or key archetypes that are then punished in the horror situation, those are the kinds of things I would have liked to see upended in this a little bit more. As it is, we've got three characters who are mostly pretty similar, and a fourth who seems quite different at the beginning, and frankly, by the end, isn't that different. And it tells a different kind of story. I don't know. Maybe I'm just rambling at this because I want this to be horror, and it just mostly isn't. Because there's a good horror movie in here. The beginning of this movie sets up a really fun horror movie, and the end is like a little bit of an underwhelming coming-of-age story. So I guess that's sort of like where it all wraps together. With that said, as far as the production goes, I don't know if there's... I didn't see any price tag on how much this cost to make. My impression is that it was probably pretty low budgeted, and I think that's fine. I think what they do with it is actually done quite well, and there's even some fun cinematic work that I think is done nicely and adds to the like sort of unique offbeat visual appeal of the of the film. At the same time, I think there are certain elements that I wish weren't done the way they were. There is a lot of overt use of CGI, and it's not trying to be hidden at all. It's very much up front and center, and it's on purpose. Well, I shouldn't say a lot, but it's prevalent throughout the film. And that's kind of fine, but what the problem is for me is that it shows up most in the scenes I like least. And I don't like those scenes least because they have CG in them. I like them least because they are the least compelling scenes already, and then they feel like they are made to be more flashy using some, post-processing computer graphics stuff. What's weirder to me and why it maybe irked me more with the more overt stuff later on is that very early on, I caught some very, to me, obvious use of CG that didn't need to be CG. Stuff like fire and sparks that could have been done practically, but weren't. And it's just obvious to me, to my eyes, that it's not done practically, and there was no reason there was little reason they couldn't have done it practically. So that bothers me a little bit more as a result. As far as the other production factors go, this is shot, a lot of it is shot very naturalistically. There's not a lot of artificial light sources. It's largely outside in nature. They use a lot of sort of the natural lighting, or at least facsimiles of natural lighting that I think do well. And it's a variety. There's some nice shots of the Scottish Highlands. It's just it's just a nice place to look at, regardless of what you're doing in it, even if you're running around in circles acting like a madman. So there's some aspects of that I think are done quite well. And then as far as the sort of it's hard to argue with the sets as a result, but then there's the costuming and stuff, which I think is all just, it's very practical. It's probably very cheap and easy to do what they did, and that's totally fine because it suits the movie. As far as the casting of the various characters, this goes back a little bit to me to what I was saying before about the characters themselves not being all that compelling, and maybe for genre reasons, maybe for not. I wanted them to be more of one thing or more of another, either more of characters or more of archetypes, I guess. But with that said, the actual acting itself, I think, is totally serviceable. The main four are, as far as I know, all fairly unknown actors. They may have other credits to their name, but they're all fairly young as well. And I think they do a fine job. Then there's various side characters that are scattered throughout the film, including Eddie Izzard, who I mentioned before, and then in a weird tie-in back to The Witch that we just watched, Kate Dickie is in here too. I shouldn't be that surprised. She's in a lot of stuff, especially in Scottish productions. So anyway, just funny to see her crop up again immediately after she did before. So overall, how do I feel about this film? I don't dislike it. It's just kind of fun and quick, and it's not super long. I think it's like less than 90 minutes maybe. It's largely inoffensive, and maybe it won't super compel you, and maybe it won't make you laugh out loud, and maybe if you're looking for something that's a little more horror, a little more gore, or something that's more in tune with the season, like I initially was, maybe it's not exactly what you wanted. But that said, you could certainly do worse with your time than to watch this. If this sort of thing is up your alley, if you like the sort of, British comedy coming of age stuff, which I do tend to, then I think that does make this possibly more compelling. If you're totally against that kind of stuff, it's not your jam at all, then probably skip it. But this is, it's fun, it's different, it's a little bit weird and off the beaten path. And you know what? I don't regret watching it. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. I'll be back with another movie very soon.